From the 2022 Commodity Classic in New Orleans, I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Meghan Grebner. With us today is Undersecretary for USDA, Robert Bonney. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you again.
Today, let's start first and talk a little bit about, as you are getting ready to prepare and talk with farmers, some of the things you want them to take away and to start the conversation with.
Well, we're in a busy time of year. You know, we have CRP sign up and our PLC and crop insurance and a lot of things. So that's part of the conversation, and making sure they know that we're ready to implement and you know, in the wake of COVID, glad to get back in the offices and work with folks in agriculture. That's clearly part of the conversation. Concerns about some of the disaster programs and making sure we get those out on time. So there's a lot of interest there and conversations about that. Lots of interest in climate change and climate smart commodities and the opportunities there. So a lot of questions around there. And you know, anytime you come here and meet with producers, you learn a lot. And so part of the reason we come here is for that, and we can take that back and do a better job of implementing our programs.
Earlier this week, Senator Bozeman from Arkansas requested some flexibility in CRP in light of the market situation, what's going on with Ukraine. What are some of your thoughts and some things to think about with that?
As you think about CRP, one of the important things to recognize is that the lands that are entered are typically pretty marginal, flood prone or otherwise. I think that there's not a lot of, there's not a ton of productive capacity relative to other agricultural lands there. We're gonna stay the course on CRP. We've got a sign up going on right now. We're looking at ways that we can use the grasslands program as well to get additional lands in there. Crop prices are high, right? That always causes, tends to cause less interest in the program. So we'll see how that general sign-up goes. We'll look at ways that we can use targeted sign-ups to make sure we get the best acres in the program. By that I mean marginal acres, ones with high environmental values. There's no interest in taking really highly productive lands out of production. Those lands, that's not what the program's intended to do. So we'll look at ways that we can maximize enrollment even as we make sure we get the right mix of lands in the program.
2023 Farm Bill is just around the corner, and I'm assuming it's a topic of conversation with farmers all over the country, but especially here this week. As you think about that, talk to me a little bit about plans for climate, sustainability, and conservation, and how farmers play a role in that conversation.
Well, it's critical. It's hard to think about how the U.S. can get where it needs to go on climate change without farmers participating. And it's going to be voluntary participation. It's going to have to be voluntary. It's going to have to be incentive-based. So there's the mitigation side, which is really important. And we'll learn some things from our partnerships program on climate smart commodities. We're learning things every day on how we implement conservation programs. One of the things you hear a lot is the need for flexibility. Every producer's different. Crop types, forestry, all different. And so we got to have flexibility. We have to build a toolbox that'll work for all of agriculture and forestry. But then there's a resilience side as well. How do we make sure agriculture is prepared to deal with drought, flooding, wildfire, all those things? And so that's going to be an important part of the conversation as well. And we're learning, you know, we've got some gaps in our programs there. We've got ad hoc disaster, obviously. You know, crop insurance is at the core of a lot of what we do. And so I think there's a conversation going into the 23 Farm Bill that's in response to that question. Do we have the tools we need to help agriculture weather these extreme events? And you know, how can we add to the portfolio to help them do that?
Drought really seems to be at the forefront again this year. We had such an early start last year in parts of cattle country. We're continuing to see drought pressure in the western part of the U.S. What are some things that, as that conversation picks up, does that help in the conversation about climate and conservation? And how does that play out as you work with those farmers?
I think everybody recognizes that the weather's changing, that we're starting to see some things we didn't a while ago. I think back to where we were when I came into the Obama administration in 2009, 2010. Big argument about is climate change happening, the science. We've sort of all put that argument aside now. And the conversation now is how do we engage? How do we engage in a way that works for agriculture? And you see that on the mitigation side. And I think that's informed by people's experience with drought, wildfire, and other things and what they see. But then obviously on the resilience side, how do we make sure that agriculture is prepared to be as resilient as it can? What are the things we can do on conservation side? NRCS has a really important role to play there. But so does new research and new ways to think about how we make sure agriculture stays productive. And I've emphasized here that productivity in and of itself is actually really important. We have to feed 9 to 10 billion people by the middle of the century, even while we reduce greenhouse gases. That means we have to be really productive, and so new technologies, new opportunities there to think about production matter for the climate.
When you talk to farmers about climate programs, conservation programs, and about working together with creating the correct problems or creating solutions that work for them, what continues to be maybe the biggest pushback or the biggest concern that you hear from farmers about climate policy and sustainability?
You know, it's interesting. It's not it's a very productive conversation. It's very different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. But there's a lot of interest in making sure that there's the flexibility that producers need, that they can continue to make the economic decisions they need to make. And so flexibility, how do we make it easy for folks to come in and out? A recognition that, you know, a producer may implement a practice for weather reasons, other reasons, they may need to change that practice. How do we design our programs to allow for that? And for us, the opportunity is to scale up broadly across lots of acres. And if we do a good job of tracking who comes in and out, I think we can master that. We can track it over time. We should be okay. But those issues related to flexibility, how can they both participate in our programs and think about, are there other market opportunities for them? That's a lot of questions we get around that.
Any final thoughts?
No, appreciate it. Good to see you. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yep.
From the 2022 Commodity Classic in New Orleans, I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.